The heavy oak doors of the chapel creaked open, but the only sound that followed was the hollow echo of my own heels on the marble floor. I stood alone over the closed mahogany casket, my hands trembling as I looked back at 20 rows of empty benches. Not a single soul sat in the seats reserved for his bloodline. My mother-in-law's seat was cold. The reserved sign for his brother was just a mocking scrap of paper in a desert of silence. Just as the priest cleared his throat to begin the service for an audience of one, my phone buzzed in my black lace glove. It was a group text from his mother, Beatrice. "We're all at the Lakeside Estate," the message read. "Don't bother calling, we've decided it's time to move on, and you should too. You were never really one of us, and now that Cyprien is gone, we don't have to pretend anymore." The sheer, calculated cruelty of their absence at Cyprien's final goodbye wasn't just a snub. It was a public execution of my dignity. They wanted me to stand here and realize that without their family name, I was absolutely nothing. The anger hit me like a physical blow, a hot wave of fury that burned through my grief. They weren't just missing a funeral. They were trying to bury my status alongside my husband. My name is Valeria. For 10 long years, I was the outsider, who did all the heavy lifting for the family business. I was the one who organized their charity galas and managed the PR disasters caused by Cyprien's younger brother, Silas. I did it because I loved Cyprien, and I believed that by serving his family, I was honoring him. Cyprien, however, was a brilliant corporate strategist who saw 3 steps ahead of everyone else. He often told me, "Valeria, they don't love you. They love the way you protect our reputation." I used to argue with him, defending the people he had grown up with, but Cyprien knew the truth of their greed. He saw how his mother, Beatrice, looked at my jewelry with envy, and how Silas looked at Cyprien's position in the family firm with malice. When he died suddenly in a car accident, the masks finally slipped. They didn't see a grieving widow. They saw a squatter they needed to evict. They coordinated this boycott to ensure the entire city saw me as an abandoned nobody. They assumed Cyprien's wealth would naturally revert to the true family, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a broken heart. Cyprien and I met on a rainy afternoon in a library, both reaching for the same book on architecture. He was steady, calm, and incredibly protective of me from the very start. Our marriage was a sanctuary, but his family treated it like a hostile takeover. His father had passed away years ago, leaving Beatrice in charge of the social standing and Cyprien in charge of the money. Beatrice always had a foundation that needed a donation, and Silas always had a startup that needed a bailout. Cyprien would sigh and write the checks, but he started keeping a private ledger of every cent they drained. He warned me that if the money ever stopped, their acceptance of me would vanish instantly. He spent his final year setting up a series of legal protections that he never fully explained to me. At the time, I thought he was just being cynical. We were the golden couple of the social register. But behind the scenes, Cyprien was building a fortress. He knew that if anything ever happened to him, his relatives would turn into a pack of wolves. I wish I had listened more closely to his warnings, instead of trying to earn the love of people who only valued my husband's bank account. The night of the accident is a blur of flashing blue lights and cold hospital hallways. The doctors told me Cyprien was gone before the ambulance even arrived. I sat in that waiting room for 6 hours, calling Beatrice, Silas, and his sister Sloane. Every single call went straight to voicemail. I sent frantic texts saying I needed them, that Cyprien was gone, that I didn't know what to do. Silence. I finally walked out of the hospital alone at 4 a.m, the cold wind biting through my thin sweater. When I finally reached Beatrice the next day, her voice was like ice. "Oh, Valeria, how inconvenient," she had said, as if Cyprien's death was a social blunder. "We're up at the Lakeside Estate this weekend. We really can't be expected to rush back for this, you understand, right? Just handle the arrangements." Silas was even worse. His first question wasn't about his brother, but whether Cyprien's seat on the board was now vacant. They were already carving up his corpse before I had even picked out a casket. Since they didn't see an immediate payout in supporting me, they chose to ignore the tragedy entirely. While I was at the chapel 3 days later, standing over Cyprien's casket, the family was still at the Lakeside Estate. I found out later from a social media post that Silas had tagged as family first. They were toasting with vintage champagne, laughing as if they were celebrating a victory rather than mourning a son and brother. They discussed how they were going to reclaim Cyprien's estate, assuming I would be too weak and broken to fight them. They truly believed that by humiliating me publicly, by leaving me to bury my husband alone, they would signal to the world that I was no longer a part of their elite circle. Beatrice told the group that Cyprien had likely left everything to a family trust she controlled, and that I would be lucky to get a monthly allowance. She convinced them all that staying away from the funeral was a strategic move to distance the name from a temporary wife. It was a conspiracy of arrogance. They laughed and ate caviar, while I stood in a silent room, saying goodbye to the only man who had ever truly stood up for me. The walk home from the cemetery was the longest mile of my life. The air was biting and cold, matching the frost that had settled in my chest. When I finally reached the mansion Cyprien and I had called home, I saw a sight that made my blood run cold. Silas's sports car was parked on the lawn, and the front door was wide open. I rushed inside to find him in Cyprien's private study, rifling through mahogany drawers and tossing papers everywhere. He was searching for Cyprien's private safe, a cigarette dangling from his lip. When he saw me, he didn't even look ashamed. "Oh, the widow returns," he sneered, kicking aside a stack of files. "I'm just taking what's ours, Valeria. Mother says you have 24 hours to pack your bags. This house has been in our name for 40 years, and we aren't letting some trophy wife sit on our assets." I stood there, stunned by the speed of their greed. My husband hadn't been in the ground for 2 hours, and his own brother was already ransacking his private office like a common grave robber. Thank God, Cyprien had insisted we install a comprehensive security system 2 years ago. Every corner of this house was being recorded. "Get out of this house," I whispered, my voice shaking with a rage I had never felt before. Silas laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Make me, Valeria. You have no standing here. The locks are being changed tomorrow morning." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked over to the desk, grabbed the heavy crystal decanter Cyprien kept there, and smashed it on the floor at Silas's feet. I said, "Get out." The noise startled him enough that I was able to grab him by the collar of his expensive jacket and shove him toward the hallway. I pushed him out onto the driveway and slammed the heavy oak door, locking every bolt and activating the security system. I stood there, leaning against the wood, listening to him scream that I was a gold digger and that he would have me arrested for theft. 10 minutes later, I got a call from Beatrice. "How dare you treat Silas that way?" She barked. "We are the pillars of this community. You are nothing. If you don't hand over the keys by tonight, I will make sure you never work or show your face in this city again." I hung up on her. 4 days after the funeral, the betrayal deepened. I went to the bank to access our joint accounts, only to find that Beatrice had filed a civil claim. She had told the bank that Cyprien was under undue influence from me and requested a temporary freeze on certain accounts pending estate settlement. I stood in the lobby of the bank I had visited for years, and the manager, a man who had attended our wedding, wouldn't even look me in the eye. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," he said, though he used my name like it was a curse. "But until the estate is settled, you have limited access to these specific accounts." Fortunately, I still had access to our primary household account and my personal credit cards. But Beatrice's social warfare had begun. I realized then that this wasn't just a family spat. It was a calculated campaign. Beatrice had used her social standing to spread rumors throughout the city. She had even started telling people that I had been neglectful during Cyprien's final days, implying that I was somehow responsible for his state of mind before the accident. She was trying to strip me of my reputation so that when they finally threw me on the street, no one would care. The first week of the boycott was the hardest. I sat in my big, silent house, waiting for someone to realize they had gone too far. I waited for a sorry that never came. Instead, I received legal notices from the family's attorneys. Beatrice was threatening to contest the will, claiming Cyprien was mentally incapacitated by grief over his father's death when he met me. The household bills were piling up, and while I had enough inaccessible accounts to maintain basics, I was being careful with every expense, unsure of what legal battles lay ahead. My credit cards worked, but I felt the noose tightening. Every time I looked at the news, I saw photos of Beatrice and Sloane at gala events, smiling and talking about the tragedy of Cyprien's passing while painting me as the villain who was holding his estate hostage. They had effectively erased my 10 years of devotion. I spent my nights huddled in Cyprien's closet, breathing in the scent of his cologne, wondering how I could have been so blind to the monsters who shared his name. By the 13th day since Cyprien's death, I was emotionally drained and uncertain about my future. I sat at my kitchen table, looking at my wedding ring. It was a beautiful, large diamond that could easily fund my life for a year if I sold it. I picked it up, ready to head to a jeweler. But then, I remembered Cyprien's voice from a conversation we had a year ago. He had once told me, "Valeria, if things ever get dark with my mother, don't sell your soul or your memories. Just wait for the 14th day." I hadn't understood what he meant at the time. I thought he was just being dramatic. But today was the 13th day since his death. I put the ring back on my finger and decided to trust him one last time. I made myself a simple meal and stared at the calendar on the wall. The family thought they had won. They thought they had successfully humiliated me into a corner where I would sign anything just to survive. They were probably waiting for me to call and beg for a settlement, but a strange calm had settled over me. Cyprien was a man of long-term strategies, and I realized he would never leave me truly defenseless. On the morning of the 14th day, a high-security courier arrived at my door. He was driving an armored black truck and wearing a formal suit. He asked for my identification and 3 different biometric scans before handing me a heavy, matte black box. There was no return address, only a small gold emblem of a lion, the crest Cyprien had designed for our private world. "Mr. Vance requested this be delivered today, and today only," the courier said before tipping his hat and leaving. My heart hammered against my ribs as I carried the box to the table. Inside, there were 3 thick, leather-bound folders, a high-end tablet, and a platinum credit card in my name with a handwritten note. "Emergency funds? No limits, no questions." There was also a longer handwritten note from Cyprien. "To my brave Valeria, if you are reading this, my family has shown you the teeth I tried to protect you from. Do not cry for them. They are not your family. They are a legacy that has rotted. Open the folders in order. The lion is out of the cage." I took a deep breath and opened the first folder, labeled The Estate. The first folder was a revelation that changed everything. For 40 years, the family had lived in the mansion, believing it was protected by a trust established by Cyprien's father. But as I read the documents, I realized the truth. The trust had gone bankrupt a decade ago due to Beatrice's reckless spending. Cyprien had quietly stepped in and bought the mansion, the grounds, and even the family's lakeside estate with his own private earnings from investments separate from the family firm. He had kept this a secret to avoid shaming his mother, but he had never put the properties back into the trust. Cyprien didn't just own the house, he was the landlord, and the family had been living there as his guests without even knowing it. Cyprien had recorded every single cent he had used to keep them afloat, documenting how Silas had stolen from the firm and how Beatrice had forged signatures on loans. There was a legal document signed by a judge stating that all these properties belonged solely to me upon Cyprien's death. Beatrice didn't own the roof over her head. I did. And she had skipped the funeral to stay at a property that was now mine. The second folder was labeled The Firm. Inside were records from the family business. I felt a sick knot in my stomach as I realized that Silas hadn't just been lazy, he had been actively embezzling funds to cover his gambling debts. He had set up fake vendors to funnel money into his personal accounts. Cyprien had discovered this months ago and had gathered every bit of forensic accounting needed to press criminal charges. There was also a series of transcripts from private investigators showing Beatrice meeting with rival firms to sell Cyprien's trade secrets in exchange for a personal payout. She wasn't just a grieving mother, she was a corporate spy who was actively working to destroy the very company Cyprien had spent his life building. Cyprien had even kept a recording of Beatrice, saying she hoped I would disappear after the funeral so she could take control of everything. She wasn't just a traitor to me, she was a traitor to her own son's legacy. The third folder was labeled Personal Messages. Inside was a single handwritten letter directing me to use the tablet. I picked up the tablet from the box and found a single video file. I pressed play and Cyprien's face appeared on the screen. He looked tired but determined, his eyes full of a sadness that broke my heart. "Valeria," he said, "I knew they would fail the test. I knew that when I was gone, they would treat you like a trespasser in your own home. That is why I made sure that everything they think they own, the name, the house, the firm, actually belongs to you. They have spent years pretending they were superior to you, while you were the one actually paying for their lifestyles." He explained that he had purposely structured his estate so they would reveal their true intentions. "The way they treated you at the chapel was their final choice," he said firmly. "Now, you must make yours. I've left you everything you need to fight back. Don't be the shield anymore, Valeria. Be the sword." I sat in the silence of the kitchen, tears of relief and grief streaming down my face. He had protected me even from beyond the grave, making sure I had the power to fight back. I spent the next week in total silence, working with the elite legal team Cyprien had secretly retained for me. The retainer had been paid in full years ago, and they were brilliant. They immediately filed motions to dismiss Beatrice's baseless civil claim and prepared counteractions. I didn't answer a single text or call from the family. They continued to send mocking messages telling me that their legal actions were moving forward and that I should start looking for cheaper accommodations. Little did they know, I was the one who was about to move the pieces on the board. I reviewed the existing security footage from our comprehensive home system, the cameras Cyprien had insisted we install 2 years prior. As I watched Silas's greed play out on the monitor, the woman who used to make excuses for him finally died, replaced by someone who no longer cared if they called her a villain. The footage of Silas ransacking the study was crystal clear. One night, I found myself watching that footage on loop, and for the first time since the funeral, I smiled. Cyprien had known exactly what they would do, and he'd made sure I wouldn't face them defenseless. I also verified the digital access codes to all of Cyprien's files and ensured everything was secured. I watched through the doorbell camera as Beatrice tried to come by to collect Cyprien's watch collection, which she claimed was a family heirloom. I didn't open the door. I sat in my darkened living room, planning the final move. I wasn't just going to take my money back. I was going to take back the respect they had tried to steal. Cyprien's legal team informed me that I now controlled more wealth than the entire bloodline combined. By the 3rd week, the lakeside estate lifestyle began to crumble. Beatrice's personal accounts were overdrawn, and the creditors realized that Cyprien was no longer there to sign the checks. I received a frantic voicemail from Silas, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and arrogance. "Valeria, pick up. The bank is saying the mortgage on the main house hasn't been paid, and they're talking about a private owner taking possession. Tell them Cyprien's estate will handle it. Just give them the authorization." I listened to it twice, feeling a cold, sharp satisfaction. Each desperate message was a small victory. Every bill they couldn't pay, every door that closed in their faces, was proof that their world only existed because Cyprien had allowed it. Then came Sloane, complaining that the lease on her luxury SUV had been terminated. "Fix this, Valeria. You're the one who always handled the administrative work. Stop being a child." I remembered how Cyprien used to hold my hand and tell me I was too kind for this world. I wish he could see me now, finally growing the thorns he knew I'd need to survive his absence. They still had no idea that there was no family estate to handle anything. The properties were mine. They truly believed I was just a confused widow who had forgotten to sign the paperwork. They didn't realize that the signatures were never going to be coming. The wolves were finally realizing the sheep had teeth. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Beatrice called me, and for the first time in 10 years, she didn't sound like a queen, she sounded like a beggar. "Valeria, dear, I know we had our differences about the funeral, but we were just so overcome with grief, we couldn't handle the public eye, she lied with practiced ease. I recorded the call, my heart as cold as ice. We need $200,000 immediately to settle Silas's debts. You've always been such a loyal part of this family. Please, for Cyprien's memory. I waited a beat before answering. Cyprien's memory? I asked. The memory you mocked while staying at the lakeside estate during his funeral? The family you told me I wasn't a part of. There was a long silence on the other end. I thought of our wedding day, when Cyprien had whispered to me during the reception. If they ever make you choose between your dignity and their approval, choose yourself every single time. I was finally listening. Then her voice turned into a hiss. Don't you dare judge me. We are the legacy. You owe us for the life we gave you. Now get that money, or I will destroy what's left of your reputation. Hearing the tremor of desperation in her voice didn't make me feel guilty. It made me feel the first stirrings of peace, knowing she could never use her status to make me feel small again. I hung up. That was the final proof I needed for the lawyers. I decided to set the ultimate trap. I sent an official-looking email to Beatrice, Silas, and Sloane from Cyprien's estate office account. I told them I had completed the estate review and wanted to have a reconciliation dinner at the mansion to discuss their inheritances and settle matters properly. I told them I had documents for all of them to review. The responses were instantaneous. They were suddenly full of apologies and love. Beatrice texted me saying she was so sorry for the misunderstanding about the legal claims and that she had been acting out of grief. Silas apologized for losing his temper in the study. They were so blinded by their own greed that they didn't even stop to wonder why the woman they had abandoned was suddenly so conciliatory. They agreed to meet at 7 p.m. on Friday. Using Cyprien's emergency credit card, I hired a professional documentation crew to position themselves discreetly in the adjacent rooms and a team of process servers to wait in the library. The stage was set for the reckoning. Friday night arrived, and the mansion was lit up, looking as grand and imposing as ever. Beatrice, Silas, and Sloane arrived in their most expensive clothes, looking like they were ready to collect a royal inheritance. They walked in with big fake smiles, trying to hug me as if the last 3 weeks of torture had never happened. I stepped back, avoiding their touch with a cold stare. Let's just eat and get to the business of the estate, I said. They sat around the long mahogany table, the same table where they had spent years making me feel like an uninvited guest. Now, they were the ones looking at me with hungry, desperate eyes. As the wine was poured, wine that I had bought with Cyprien's money, Beatrice started speaking. To finally putting this unpleasantness behind us and honoring Cyprien's legacy properly. They all murmured agreement, their faces glowing with the thought of the inheritance coming their way. They began to discuss their plans for the properties, laughing about how they were going to restore the family name. I sat there, watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to drop the curtain. I have something to show you before we discuss the documents, I said, standing up. The room went quiet. I pulled out the tablet and connected it to the large screen in the dining room. First, I played the security footage of Silas ransacking Cyprien's study on the day of the funeral. His face went pale as he watched himself on screen, tearing through drawers and scattering confidential documents. Then, I played the recording of Beatrice's threatening phone call where she called me worthless and demanded I hand over money. Finally, I showed the bank records of Silas's embezzlement and Beatrice's documented meetings with competitors. The room was deathly silent, the air thick with the smell of their fear. This is who you are, I said, my voice echoing in the large room. You didn't come to the funeral because you thought I was a nobody. You came here tonight because you think I'm a bank. Beatrice stood up, slamming her hand on the table. Enough of this. Where are the inheritance documents? You promised us our shares. I smiled, and it was the most dangerous look I had ever given them. There are no shares for you, because you don't own this house. I do, and you're all trespassing. The chaos that followed was a masterpiece of dramatic irony. Silas tried to scream that the records were fake, but I signaled the library doors to open, and the process servers walked out. They handed Silas a notice informing him of the criminal complaint being filed for embezzlement and Beatrice a cease and desist for her attempts at corporate espionage, along with documentation that the civil claim against the estate had been dismissed by the court that very afternoon. Their faces turned a sickly shade of gray as they realized their social status was evaporating in real time. Sloane tried to cry, claiming she didn't know what was happening, but I handed her the eviction notice for her apartment, which, it turned out, Cyprien had also been paying for all these years. My attorney stepped forward, stopping Silas from lunging at me. Beatrice was shaking, her face red with a desperate fury. "You can't do this. This is our ancestral home." I pulled out the deed, signed and stamped by the state. "It was your home until you spent every cent of the original trust. Cyprien saved you for years, but I'm not Cyprien. I'm the woman you left alone in a chapel, and as of this moment, you have 10 minutes to leave before I call the police for trespassing." "You're a monster!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking as she realized the outsider had won. "How can you do this to Cyprien's own family?" I looked her dead in the eye, my voice calm and steady. "Cyprien's family was in that casket. You were just his burdens, and I'm putting them down." I signaled my attorney, and the team began to escort them out of the house. They protested loudly, making a scene that the documentation cameras captured in full. As they were led down the front steps, they saw several neighbors who had gathered, drawn by the commotion. The perfect reputation they had spent decades building was cracking before their eyes. They were caught being removed from a house they claimed to own, raging at a grieving widow. The power shift was total, and it was final. They had tried to humiliate me in private and public. Now their true nature was being exposed. The downfall was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, word spread through the community about the confrontation and the evidence of embezzlement. The firm's board immediately suspended Silas and launched an internal investigation. Beatrice was forced to vacate the lakeside estate within a week and move into a modest apartment funded by a small trust, one that Cyprien had actually set up years ago for her basic needs, should she ever face financial ruin of her own making. It gave her just enough to live simply, but never enough to wield social influence again. She sent me hundreds of emails, begging for forgiveness, claiming she was misled by Silas. I blocked every single one of them. The payback wasn't just about the money or the properties, it was the fact that they now had to live with the truth of who they were. They were no longer the royalty of the city. They were cautionary tales of what happens when you choose greed over family. They were the ones who were finally nothing. The most significant emotional payoff happened a month later. I received a letter from the firm's board of directors. They had conducted a full audit, and because of the evidence I provided, they were able to address the financial misconduct before it caused irreparable damage to the company. They thanked me for my courage and asked if I would consider taking an advisory role, given my years of experience managing the family's public affairs and my clear understanding of the business. I walked into the boardroom, and the executives who had once barely acknowledged me at social functions stood and greeted me with genuine respect. They knew the truth now. I wasn't the trophy wife. I was the one who had protected Cyprien's life's work when his own family tried to burn it down. I looked around the room and realized that for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who saw my worth. I had lost a husband, but I had gained my own identity. The humiliation they tried to heap on me had become the foundation for my new life. I was no longer the woman who begged for their acceptance. I was the woman who had survived them and came out stronger. On the 1-year anniversary of Cyprien's death, I went back to the chapel. This time I wasn't alone. I was accompanied by the people who had actually cared for him. His old colleagues, the staff he had mentored, and the friends who had stood by me during the storm. The pews were full of flowers and genuine tears. I stood at the same spot where I had once felt so abandoned, but I didn't feel any pain. I looked at the marble floor and remembered the echo of my lonely heels. That sound was gone now, replaced by the steady heartbeat of a woman who was finally free. I had taken Cyprien's advice. I had stopped being the shield and became the sword. His blood relatives were a memory of a dark time, but I was standing in the light. I placed a single lion-themed coin on Cyprien's headstone and whispered, "The pride is safe." As I walked away, I didn't look back once. The final chapter had been written, the truth was out, and the widow they tried to break was now the guardian of everything Cyprien had built. I was free, I was respected, and most importantly, I was Cyprien's true legacy.
Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. There's another one waiting on your screen right now.